Mother Bear rang the code, blue alarm for a breathless infant. What happened next was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The night air carried a strange silence through Pine Valley Medical Center. Nurse Rebecca Winters had been working the graveyard shift for 3 years, but tonight felt different. The hospital sat on the edge of a dense forest, and usually the sounds of nature provided a gentle backdrop to her rounds. Tonight, even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Rebecca checked her watch as she walked down the dimly lit corridor toward the neonatal unit. It was 2:47 a.m., and most of the hospital slept peacefully. The soft beeping of monitors and the gentle hum of ventilators created a rhythm she had grown accustomed to. Her footsteps echoed softly on the polished floor as she approached room 312, where baby Marcos Thompson lay sleeping in his crib. The 6-week-old infant had been born premature, spending his first weeks fighting for every breath. His parents, David and Claire Thompson, had finally been able to take him home just last week, only to rush back when his breathing became labored again. Rebecca had grown attached to the tiny fighter during his previous stay, often staying past her shift to check on him. As she peered through the window of room 312, something caught her attention. Marcus looked peaceful, his small chest rising and falling in what appeared to be normal rhythm. His parents slept in chairs beside his crib, exhaustion etched on their faces even in sleep. Claire's hand rested protectively near her son's crib, while David's head was tilted back, mouth slightly open as he snored softly. Rebecca smiled at the scene and was about to continue her rounds when a low rumble echoed from somewhere outside the building. She paused, listening carefully. Living near the forest meant occasional visits from deer or raccoons, but this sound was deeper, more powerful. She dismissed it as her imagination and continued toward the next room. Room 314 housed twin girls, born just 2 days ago to the Martinez family. As Rebecca approached, the rumbling sound came again, this time accompanied by what sounded like heavy footsteps on pavement. She quickened her pace, checking on the twins before moving to the large window at the end of the hallway. The loading dock below was illuminated by a single security light, casting long shadows across the concrete. Rebecca pressed her face against the cool glass, scanning the area below. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling that something was wrong continued to gnaw at her. Dr. Samuel Chen, the attending physician for the night shift, emerged from the elevator carrying a cup of coffee. His usually neat hair was slightly disheveled, and his scrub showed the evidence of a long night in the emergency room. "Rebecca, everything quiet up here?" he asked, joining her at the window. "Mostly," she replied, still gazing outside. "I keep hearing strange sounds from outside. Probably just my mind playing tricks on me." Dr. Chen took a sip of his coffee and looked out the window. "The forest can be unpredictable at night. Last month, we had a family of raccoons get into the cafeteria's dumpster, made quite a mess." As they spoke, the sound came again, much closer this time. Both Rebecca and Dr. Chen turned toward the window, pressing their faces against the glass. The loading dock remained empty, but now they could hear what sounded like sniffing and heavy breathing. "That doesn't sound like raccoons," Rebecca whispered. Dr. Chen set down his coffee cup and pulled out his phone. "I should call security. Better safe than sorry." Before he could dial, a massive shape moved into the circle of light below. Rebecca gasped, grabbing Dr. Chen's arm. Standing on the loading dock was the largest bear either of them had ever seen. The creature appeared to be a female, her thick brown fur glistening in the artificial light. She moved with purpose, her massive head swaying from side to side as she investigated the area. "Oh my God," Rebecca breathed. "How did she get past the fence?" The bear approached the loading dock's overhead door, standing on her hind legs to reach a height of nearly 8 feet. Her massive paws pressed against the metal surface as she appeared to be searching for something. Then, without warning, she dropped back to all fours and moved toward a red emergency button mounted on the wall beside the dock entrance. "She's not going to—" Dr. Chen started, but his words were cut short as the bear's massive paw struck the emergency button with surprising precision. Immediately, the code blue alarm began blaring throughout the hospital. The piercing sound echoed through every corridor, jerking sleeping patients and family members awake. Rebecca and Dr. Chen stood frozen at the window, watching as the bear stepped back from the button, almost as if she was satisfied with her work. "This is impossible, Doctor," Chen muttered, reaching for his phone again. "Bears don't understand human technology." But as they watched, the bear did something even more extraordinary. She sat down on the loading dock, facing the hospital, and let out a series of deep, resonant calls that seemed to harmonize with the code blue alarm. Her vocalizations weren't aggressive or threatening. They sounded almost urgent. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Something in the bear's behavior triggered an instinct she couldn't explain. Without saying a word to Dr. Chen, she turned and began running toward the neonatal unit. "Rebecca, where are you going?" Dr. Chen called after her, but she was already disappearing around the corner. Her feet moved faster than her conscious mind could process. The code blue alarm continued to wail, and hospital staff were beginning to emerge from various rooms, confusion written on their faces. The overnight charge nurse, Patricia Valdez, appeared from the nurses' station with a concerned expression. "What's happening? Why is the code blue alarm going off?" Patricia asked, but Rebecca rushed past her without stopping. Something was pulling her toward room 312, an invisible force she couldn't resist. As she burst through the door, she found David and Claire Thompson sitting up in their chairs, awakened by the alarm, looking around in confusion. "What's wrong? Why is the alarm going off?" Claire asked, her voice thick with sleep and rising panic. Rebecca moved quickly to Marcus's crib, her trained eyes immediately scanning the infant. At first glance, he appeared to be sleeping peacefully, but as she looked closer, her heart began to race. The baby's chest was barely moving, and his lips had taken on a bluish tint that hadn't been there during her previous check. "Oh no," she whispered, immediately reaching for the oxygen saturation monitor. The numbers on the screen made her blood run cold. Oxygen saturation at 68% and dropping. "Marcus!" Claire screamed, jumping from her chair as Rebecca began emergency procedures. The bear outside let out another call, this one longer and more mournful, as if she somehow knew her message had been received. Rebecca's hands moved with practiced precision as she adjusted Marcus's position and checked his airway. The infant's breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible, and his tiny fingers were beginning to turn the same frightening shade of blue as his lips. The code blue alarm continued to shriek through the hospital corridors, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos that seemed to match the urgency of the moment. "Call the respiratory team now," Rebecca shouted to David Thompson, who stood frozen beside his wife. "Press the red button by the door." David stumbled toward the wall, his hand shaking as he searched for the emergency button. Claire had moved to the opposite side of Marcus's crib, tears streaming down her face as she watched her son struggle for each breath. "What's happening to him?" "He was fine when we went to sleep," Claire sobbed. "Please tell me he's going to be okay." Rebecca wanted to offer reassurance, but her training taught her to focus on action rather than words in critical moments. She had seen too many situations where false hope proved more damaging than honest uncertainty. As she began manual ventilation assistance, she could hear footsteps rushing down the hallway toward their room. Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, still carrying his cup of coffee, which he quickly set aside when he saw the scene before him. Behind him came Patricia Valdez and two other nurses from the evening shift who had been awakened by the alarm. "Respiratory distress," Rebecca called out without looking up from Marcus. "Oxygen saturation dropped to 68% and falling. Started manual ventilation 30 seconds ago." Dr. Chen moved swiftly to the other side of the crib, his earlier confusion about the bear temporarily forgotten in the face of a medical emergency. As he began his assessment, the sound of the bear's calls continued to drift through the walls, creating an eerie soundtrack to the unfolding crisis. "Has anyone figured out why the code blue alarm is going off?" Patricia asked, glancing around the room in confusion. "There's a bear outside," Dr. Chen said absently, his attention focused on Marcus's vital signs. She activated the loading dock emergency button. Patricia stared at him with wide eyes. "A bear? Did you just say there's a bear outside our hospital?" Before Dr. Chen could respond, the respiratory therapist, Miguel Santos, rushed into the room wheeling a cart of emergency equipment. Miguel had worked at Pine Valley Medical for 15 years and had a reputation for remaining calm under pressure. But even he seemed rattled by the wailing alarm that showed no signs of stopping. "What's the situation?" Miguel asked, immediately beginning to set up advanced respiratory support equipment. "6-week-old male, previous history of respiratory distress, currently showing severe oxygen desaturation," Dr. Chen reported. "We need to establish better airway support immediately." As Miguel worked to position the equipment, Rebecca found herself listening to the bear's calls outside. There was something about the rhythm and tone that seemed almost communicative. She had grown up on a farm before becoming a nurse and had always felt a connection to animals, but this was unlike anything she had ever experienced. "The bear," she said suddenly, causing everyone in the room to look at her. "She's still out there, and she's still calling." David Thompson, who had been standing helplessly by the wall, suddenly spoke up. "What bear? What are you talking about?" Dr. Chen glanced toward the window, then back at Marcus. "There's a large female bear on our loading dock. She's the one who activated the code blue alarm." Claire looked up from her son, confusion mixing with the terror on her face. "A bear? That doesn't make any sense. Why would a bear?" Her words trailed off as the sound of the bear's voice grew louder, almost as if the animal was responding to the conversation inside the room. The calls had a haunting quality that seemed to reach into something primal in each person present. Miguel had successfully established better respiratory support for Marcus, and the infant's oxygen levels began to slowly improve. As the numbers on the monitor crept upward, the bear's calls outside began to change in tone, becoming less urgent and more relieved. "This is the strangest thing I've ever experienced," Patricia muttered, shaking her head. "In 25 years of nursing, I've never seen anything like this." Dr. Chen was monitoring Marcus's heart rate when something occurred to him. "Rebecca, what made you come running to this room? The code blue alarm was triggered outside, not by any equipment in here." Rebecca paused, her hands still working to support Marcus's breathing. The question had been nagging at her since she first heard the bear, but she hadn't had time to fully process her own actions. "I don't know," she said quietly. "When I saw the bear press that button, something just told me to come here, like she was trying to tell us something." Miguel looked up from his equipment. You're saying the bear somehow knew this baby was in distress? I know how it sounds, Rebecca replied, but the timing can't be a coincidence. Marcus was fine when I checked on him 20 minutes ago. The bear showed up, pressed the emergency button, and that's when I found him like this. Outside, the bear's calls had become softer, almost like a lullaby. The sound drifted through the hospital walls, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that none of them could ignore. David Thompson had been listening to the conversation with growing amazement. You're telling me that a wild bear somehow saved our son's life? Before anyone could answer, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the room. Security guard Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway, his radio crackling with static. Jake was a former military police officer who had worked at the hospital for just over a year, and his usual confidence seemed shaken. Dr. Chen, we have a situation, Jake said, slightly out of breath. That bear outside, she's not alone. Everyone in the room turned toward Jake, their attention temporarily diverted from Marcus, whose breathing was now steadying under Miguel's care. What do you mean she's not alone? Dr. Chen asked. Jake stepped further into the room, his hand resting on his radio. I've been monitoring the security cameras. There are 2 cubs with her now. They appeared about 5 minutes ago, and they're all just sitting there, watching the hospital. Patricia crossed herself and whispered a prayer in Spanish. This is getting more bizarre by the minute. Claire Thompson looked between her improving son and the security guard. Cubs, there are baby bears outside? Yes, ma'am, Jake confirmed. 2 of them, probably a few months old. They're staying close to their mother, and none of them are showing any aggressive behavior. They're just waiting. Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. Waiting for what? As if in response to her question, the bear outside let out another call, this one distinctly different from the others. It was shorter, almost like a question, and it was followed by complete silence. Marcus chose that moment to let out a small cry, his first vocal sound since the crisis began. The cry was weak but clear, and it seemed to carry through the walls of the hospital room. Immediately, the bear outside responded with what could only be described as a sound of satisfaction, followed by softer vocalizations that sounded almost like purring. Miguel stared at his equipment readings in amazement. His vitals are stabilizing rapidly. Whatever respiratory episode he was having seems to be resolving. Dr. Chen shook his head in disbelief. In 15 years of pediatric medicine, I've never seen anything like this. The timing, the bear's behavior, the way she seemed to know. Jake's radio crackled to life with the voice of his supervisor. Morrison, what's the status on that wildlife situation? Jake lifted his radio to his mouth, pausing as he looked around the room at the faces staring back at him. Still monitoring, sir. The animals appear to be protective rather than threatening. Protective? Came the response through the static. Protective of what? Jake glanced at baby Marcus, who was now breathing normally and had regained his natural color. I'm not sure you'd believe me if I told you, sir. The bear's voice came again, but this time it was joined by smaller, higher-pitched sounds that could only be coming from the cubs. The family of bears seemed to be having their own conversation, and somehow everyone in the hospital room felt like they were part of it. Rebecca moved closer to the window, trying to get a glimpse of the animals below. I need to see them, she said quietly. Rebecca, that might not be safe, Dr. Chen warned. I'm not going outside, she replied. I just need to understand what's happening here. As she peered out the window, she could see the loading dock clearly illuminated by the security lights. The mother bear sat in the center of the concrete area, her massive frame relaxed but alert. On either side of her were 2 small cubs, their dark fur making them almost invisible in the shadows except for their eyes, which reflected the artificial light. What struck Rebecca most was the way the mother bear held herself. There was no aggression in her posture, no signs of the defensive behavior she would expect from a wild animal with cubs near a human facility. Instead, the bear seemed peaceful, almost as if she was exactly where she belonged. "They're beautiful," Rebecca whispered, her breath fogging the window glass. Claire Thompson had approached the window as well, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had brought Rebecca running to her son's room. "The mother is so big," she said softly. How did she know Marcus needed help? That question hung in the air like the bear's calls, unanswered but heavy with possibility. Marcus continued to breathe steadily in his crib, his crisis having passed as mysteriously as it had begun. The code blue alarm had finally been silenced, but its echo seemed to linger in everyone's memory. Miguel was packing up his emergency equipment, shaking his head as he worked. 30 years in respiratory therapy, and I've never responded to a code blue that was triggered by a bear. This is definitely going in my report. Dr. Chen was reviewing Marcus's chart when another thought occurred to him. "Rebecca, you said the bear was very specific about which button she pressed. The loading dock has several emergency controls. How did she know to press the code blue alarm?" Rebecca turned from the window, her expression thoughtful. "That's what I keep wondering. It wasn't random." She walked right to that specific button, pressed it deliberately, and then sat down to wait, like she knew exactly what would happen. Jake's radio buzzed again. "Morrison, Animal Control is en route. ETA 10 minutes. This announcement caused an immediate shift in the room's atmosphere. David Thompson looked up from his son with concern. "Animal Control. What will they do to the bears?" Jake lowered his radio. "Standard protocol for wildlife near the hospital is relocation. They'll probably tranquilize the mother and cubs and move them deeper into the forest." "No," Claire said suddenly, surprising everyone with the force in her voice. "They can't do that. Not after what she did for Marcus." Dr. Chen placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder. "I understand how you feel, but we have to consider the safety of our patients and staff. Wild bears, even well-intentioned ones, can be unpredictable." Rebecca was still watching the bear family through the window when she noticed something that made her gasp. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this." Everyone crowded around the window, following Rebecca's gaze to the loading dock below. The mother bear had stood up and was now facing the forest. She was making soft vocalizations to her cubs, who were responding with small chirping sounds. It looked exactly like a mother giving instructions to her children. "She's leaving," Patricia observed. "It's like she knows her job is done." As they watched, the mother bear began walking slowly toward the tree line, her cubs following closely behind her. But every few steps, she would stop and look back at the hospital, as if making sure her message had been understood. "Wait," Miguel said, pointing toward the loading dock. "Look at where she was sitting." Where the bear had positioned herself on the concrete, she had left behind something that glinted in the security lights. Rebecca squinted, trying to make out what it was. "I have to go down there," she said, already moving toward the door. "Rebecca, absolutely not," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Those bears might come back." "They're leaving?" Rebecca replied. "And they left something behind. I need to know what it is." Jake stepped forward. "I'll go with her. I have my gear and I can radio for backup if needed." Rebecca looked at Jake with gratitude. "Thank you." As they prepared to leave the room, Marcus let out another small cry, this one stronger and more alert than before. Claire immediately moved to comfort her son, tears of relief streaming down her face. "He's going to be okay," she whispered. "Our little boy is going to be okay." The bear's final call echoed from the forest, distant now, but still audible. It sounded like a farewell, a gentle goodbye from one mother to another. As the sound faded into the night, everyone in the room felt they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would change their understanding of the world around them. Rebecca and Jake made their way through the hospital corridors toward the loading dock entrance. The emergency lighting had been activated during the code blue alarm, casting long shadows that danced along the walls as they walked. Jake's heavy boots echoed against the linoleum floor, while Rebecca's soft-soled nursing shoes made barely a whisper of sound. "I still can't believe what I just witnessed," Jake said, his hand resting on his radio as they approached the exit. 23 years of military and security work, and I've never seen anything like this. Rebecca pushed through the heavy metal door that led to the loading dock, the cool night air hitting her face like a gentle slap. The concrete area was eerily quiet now, with only the distant hum of the hospital's ventilation system breaking the silence. The security lights created a harsh circle of brightness against the darkness of the forest beyond. "There," Rebecca pointed toward the center of the loading dock where the mother bear had been sitting. "Can you see it?" Jake pulled out a small flashlight and directed its beam toward the spot. What they saw made both of them freeze in place. Sitting on the concrete, arranged with deliberate care, was a small collection of items that definitely hadn't been there before. They approached slowly, Jake keeping his flashlight trained on the objects while Rebecca knelt down to examine them more closely. There were 3 items arranged in a perfect triangle: a smooth river stone, a piece of bark that had been carefully stripped from a tree, and something that made Rebecca's breath catch in her throat. "Jake, shine your light on this one," she said softly, pointing to the 3rd object. As the beam illuminated the item, they both realized they were looking at a small wooden carving. It was crude but unmistakably intentional, carved to resemble a tiny human figure. The craftsmanship was rough, clearly made with claws rather than tools, but the effort and care that had gone into creating it was undeniable. "Bears don't carve wood," Jake said quietly, his voice filled with disbelief. Rebecca picked up the carving, turning it over in her hands. The wood was fresh, still slightly damp with sap, indicating it had been made recently. Very recently. "This isn't possible," she whispered. "Animals don't create art." As she examined the carving more closely, she noticed something that made her heart race. The tiny figure wasn't just any human form, it was clearly meant to represent an infant. The proportions, the way the arms were positioned, even tiny details that suggested swaddling clothes had been carved with remarkable precision considering the tools available to whoever had made it. "Rebecca, we need to call Dr. Chen," Jake said, his military training warring with what his eyes were telling him. "This changes everything." Before Rebecca could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching from the main road. 2 sets of headlights cut through the darkness as the animal control trucks arrived at the hospital. Jake's radio immediately crackled to life. "Morrison, this is Control. Animal Control Team is on site. Please report to the main entrance for briefing." Jake looked at Rebecca, then at the objects in her hands. "What do I tell them?" Rebecca stood up slowly, cradling the wooden carving against her chest. "The truth, even if they don't believe it." They made their way back toward the hospital entrance, where 2 animal control officers were unloading equipment from their trucks. The lead officer, a weathered man in his 50s named Captain Rodriguez, approached them with the confident stride of someone who had dealt with countless wildlife situations. "Officer Morrison." "I'm Captain Rodriguez, Animal Control. We received reports of a large bear with cubs near the hospital. Where exactly did you last see these animals? Jake gestured toward the loading dock. They were there about 10 minutes ago, but they've moved back into the forest. Captain, there's something you need to know about this situation. Captain Rodriguez's partner, a younger woman named Officer Sarah Mitchell, was checking the tranquilizer equipment. Standard relocation, right? Large female with cubs shouldn't be too difficult to handle. It's not standard, Rebecca interjected, still holding the wooden carving. This bear, she saved a baby's life tonight. Both animal control officers stopped what they were doing and stared at Rebecca. Captain Rodriguez had heard many unusual stories in his 25 years on the job, but this was a new one. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. Jake stepped forward. Captain, the bear deliberately activated our code blue emergency alarm. At the exact moment, an infant in our neonatal unit was experiencing respiratory distress. If she hadn't triggered that alarm, we might not have found the baby in time. Officer Mitchell looked between Jake and Rebecca with obvious skepticism. Bears don't understand human technology. What you're describing is impossible. Rebecca held out the wooden carving. Then how do you explain this? Captain Rodriguez took the carving from Rebecca's hands, examining it under the beam of his flashlight. His expression slowly changed from skepticism to confusion, then to something approaching awe. Where did you find this? The bear left it, Rebecca said simply, along with these other items. She showed him the stone and the piece of bark. Captain Rodriguez turned the carving over in his weathered hands. He had seen many things in his career, but never anything like this. The craftsmanship was clearly not human, yet it was undeniably intentional art. Sarah, come look at this, he called to his partner. Officer Mitchell approached, her skepticism still evident on her young face. But as she examined the carving, her expression began to mirror her supervisor's confusion. This doesn't make sense, she said quietly. Animals don't create representational art. It's one of the defining characteristics that separates humans from other species. That's what we thought too, Jake said. But tonight we've seen a lot of things that don't make sense. Dr. Chen emerged from the hospital, having left Marcus's care to Miguel and Patricia while he came to speak with the animal control team. He approached the group with the measured stride of someone trying to process extraordinary events through the lens of scientific training. Officers, I'm Dr. Samuel Chen, attending physician. I understand you're here about our unusual visitors. Captain Rodriguez held up the wooden carving. Doctor, did you know that your bear visitor is apparently an artist? Dr. Chen examined the carving, his medical training warring with the evidence before his eyes. This is remarkable. The level of fine motor control required to create something like this, it suggests cognitive abilities we've never documented in wild animals. Officer Mitchell was setting up a laptop computer on the hood of her truck. I'm running a search through our database of unusual animal behavior reports. Maybe there have been other incidents like this. As she typed, her expression grew increasingly puzzled. This is strange. I'm finding several reports from the past 6 months of bears displaying unusual behavior near medical facilities. Everyone gathered around the laptop screen as Officer Mitchell pulled up the reports. The first was from a hospital in Colorado, where a bear had been observed sitting outside the emergency room for several hours before disappearing. The second was from a clinic in Montana, where a bear had approached the building during a medical emergency and had remained nearby until ambulances arrived. There are 5 more reports, Officer Mitchell said, scrolling through the database, all involving bears near medical facilities, all during times when there were medical emergencies involving children. Dr. Chen felt a chill run down his spine. Are you suggesting there's some kind of pattern here? Captain Rodriguez was studying the reports with growing amazement. If these reports are accurate, we're looking at behavior that goes beyond anything we understand about animal intelligence and empathy. Rebecca had been listening to the conversation while continuously glancing toward the forest where the bear family had disappeared. Something was nagging at her, a feeling that they were missing an important piece of the puzzle. "Captain Rodriguez, how long have you been tracking wildlife in this area?" "About 15 years, he replied. "Why do you ask?" "Have you ever had reports of a large female bear with cubs in this particular section of forest before tonight?" Captain Rodriguez considered the question carefully. "No, actually, this territory is usually occupied by smaller bears, mostly males. A female with cubs would typically stay deeper in the forest, away from human activity." Officer Mitchell looked up from her laptop. "That's another unusual aspect. Female bears with cubs are extremely protective and avoid human contact whenever possible. But according to your security footage, this bear deliberately approached your facility." Jake nodded toward his radio. "I can pull up the security footage if you'd like to see it. The bear's behavior was unlike anything I've ever witnessed." As Jake went to retrieve the footage, Dr. Chen's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at the screen and his face went pale. "What is it?" Rebecca asked, noticing his expression. "It's from Dr. Martinez at Children's Hospital in Denver," Dr. Chen said slowly. "She's asking if we've had any unusual animal activity tonight. Apparently, they just had a situation where a bear activated their emergency alarm system during a pediatric crisis." The group fell silent, the implications of this information settling over them like a heavy blanket. Captain Rodriguez looked at his partner, then back at the hospital. "Officer Mitchell, I want you to contact every major medical facility within a 200-mile radius. Ask them if they've had any unusual bear activity in the past 48 hours. As Officer Mitchell began making calls, Rebecca found herself drawn back toward the forest. The feeling that they were missing something important continued to grow stronger. She walked to the edge of the loading dock where the concrete met the grass that led to the tree line. "Hello?" she called softly into the darkness. "Are you still out there?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a soft response. It wasn't the powerful call they had heard earlier, but a gentle, almost conversational sound. Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered into the night. "Thank you for saving Marcus." The response came immediately, a warm, rumbling sound that seemed to wrap around her like a hug. Then silence returned to the forest. Dr. Chen approached Rebecca, the wooden carving still in his hands. "I've been thinking about what happened tonight, and I keep coming back to one question. How did she know?" "What do you mean?" "Marcus's respiratory episode was internal, silent. There were no external signs of distress. His parents were sleeping right next to him and didn't notice anything was wrong. How could a bear outside the building possibly have known he was in trouble?" Rebecca turned the question over in her mind. It was the central mystery of the entire evening, the one piece that didn't fit any rational explanation. "Maybe she didn't know about Marcus specifically," Rebecca said slowly. "Maybe she sensed something else." "Like what?" Rebecca looked back toward the forest, then at the hospital behind them. What if it wasn't about Marcus at all? What if there's something bigger happening here that we don't understand yet? Officer Mitchell finished her calls and rejoined the group, her expression grave. "I've contacted 12 major medical facilities in the region. 7 of them report unusual bear activity in the past week. All 7 incidents occurred during medical emergencies involving children under the age of 2. Captain Rodriguez shook his head in disbelief. That's statistically impossible. There has to be an explanation. There is, said a new voice from behind them. Everyone turned to see an elderly man approaching from the parking area. He was tall and thin, with silver hair and weathered hands that suggested a lifetime of outdoor work. He walked with the confident stride of someone comfortable in the wilderness, and his eyes held the sharp intelligence of a person who had spent years observing the natural world. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the man said as he reached the group. "I'm Professor James Whitfield from the university's Wildlife Research Department. I was monitoring radio frequencies tonight and heard the reports about your situation here." Dr. Chen stepped forward. "Professor, I'm Dr. Chen. Are you saying you have an explanation for what we've witnessed tonight?" Professor Whitfield nodded, his expression serious. "I believe you've encountered something we've been tracking for the past 8 months. We call them the Sentinels." "Sentinels?" Rebecca asked. "A group of bears that have been displaying unprecedented levels of empathy and intelligence. They seem to have developed an ability to sense human distress, particularly in very young children. We've been documenting their behavior across multiple states." Officer Mitchell looked skeptical. "Professor, bears are intelligent animals, but what you're describing sounds more like science fiction than wildlife behavior." Professor Whitfield reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet computer. "I have documentation, video footage, behavioral studies, and analysis that suggests we're witnessing an evolutionary leap in animal consciousness." He activated the tablet and showed them a video of a large bear approaching a rural clinic. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 weeks earlier. In the footage, the bear moved with the same purposeful behavior they had witnessed tonight, approaching an emergency entrance and remaining nearby until medical personnel emerged. "This was taken in Wyoming," Professor Whitfield explained. "The bear stayed outside the clinic for 2 hours while doctors worked to save a premature infant inside. The moment the child was stabilized, the bear left." Dr. Chen studied the footage with fascination. "How many of these sentinels have you identified?" "We believe there are at least 12 females across the western United States. All of them are mothers themselves, and all of them seem to be drawn to situations involving human infants in distress." Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. "The carving," she said suddenly. "Show him the carving." Dr. Chen handed the wooden figure to Professor Whitfield, who examined it with obvious excitement. "Remarkable," he breathed. "This is the first physical artifact we've discovered. The cognitive abilities required to create this." He trailed off, shaking his head in amazement. "Professor," Captain Rodriguez said, "if what you're telling us is true, these animals aren't just displaying unusual behavior. They're showing capabilities that shouldn't be possible." Professor Whitfield looked up from the carving. "Captain, I believe we're witnessing something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. These bears have developed not just enhanced empathy, but what appears to be a form of interspecies communication. They're trying to help us." As if summoned by his words, a soft call echoed from the forest. Everyone turned toward the sound, and there, at the edge of the tree line, they could see 3 pairs of eyes reflecting the security lights. The bear family had returned, and they were watching the human gathering with what appeared to be curious interest. "She's back," Rebecca whispered, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and reverence. Professor Whitfield slowly approached the edge of the loading dock, moving with careful, non-threatening gestures. "May I try something?" he asked the group. Without waiting for an answer, he held up the wooden carving and spoke in a calm, gentle voice toward the forest. "Thank you for this gift. We understand what you did tonight, and we're grateful." The response was immediate. The mother bear stepped out of the tree line, followed by her cubs. She moved slowly, deliberately, until she was standing at the boundary between the forest and the hospital grounds. Then she sat down, mirroring her earlier position on the loading dock. "This is incredible," Officer Mitchell whispered, her earlier skepticism completely gone. "She's responding to human speech." The bear lifted her massive head and let out a series of soft vocalizations that sounded remarkably like a conversation. The cubs responded with their own small sounds, creating what could only be described as a family discussion. Professor Whitfield listened intently, then turned back to the group. "I believe she's trying to tell us something important." As he spoke, the bear stood up and began walking toward them again, but this time her approach was different. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if asking permission to come closer. Rebecca felt the same inexplicable pull she had experienced earlier in the evening. Without conscious thought, she began walking toward the bear, ignoring the concerned voices behind her. "Rebecca, stop!" Jake called out, but she continued moving forward. The bear and the nurse met in the middle of the loading dock, standing just a few feet apart. Up close, Rebecca could see the intelligence in the animal's dark eyes, a depth of understanding that took her breath away. The bear made a soft sound, almost like a whisper, and gently reached out one massive paw. Rebecca, acting on pure instinct, extended her hand. For just a moment, human fingers touched bear fur, and Rebecca felt a surge of connection unlike anything she had ever experienced. In that instant, images flashed through her mind. She saw the forest from the bear's perspective, felt the overwhelming urge to protect the vulnerable, understood the deep maternal instinct that had driven this magnificent creature to seek out human help. And in the center of it all, she sensed something that made her gasp with recognition. The bear wasn't just responding to Marcus's crisis. She was warning them about something much bigger that was coming. As the connection faded, the bear stepped back and looked directly at Professor Whitfield. Then she turned and walked back toward her cubs, pausing only once to look over her shoulder at the assembled humans before disappearing into the forest. Rebecca stood frozen in place, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. When she finally turned back to the group, her face was pale with shock. "She showed me something," Rebecca said quietly. "There's more coming, more emergencies, and she's not the only one who knows about it." The implications of her words settled over the group like a storm cloud, heavy with the promise of revelations yet to come. Professor Whitfield immediately stepped closer to Rebecca, his scientific curiosity overriding any concern for protocol. "Rebecca, I need you to tell me exactly what you experienced when you touched her. Every detail, no matter how strange it might seem." Rebecca's hands were trembling as she tried to process what had happened. The connection with the bear had been unlike anything she could have imagined. More vivid than a dream, but somehow more real than waking life. She closed her eyes, trying to recall the flood of images and sensations that had rushed through her mind. "I saw the forest, but not like we see it," she began slowly. "I could sense every living thing within miles, every heartbeat, every breath, and I felt this overwhelming need to protect, especially the young ones. But it wasn't just about animals, it included human children, too." Dr. Chen moved closer, his medical training making him wonder if Rebecca was experiencing some kind of shock or hallucination. "Rebecca, you've been through a traumatic evening. Are you sure what you experienced was real?" "I'm sure," Rebecca said firmly, opening her eyes to look at the group. "And there's more. I saw other bears, dozens of them, all moving with the same purpose. They're not acting randomly, they're coordinated, like they're following some kind of plan." Officer Mitchell had been taking notes on her tablet, but she stopped typing and looked up with concern. A plan? You're saying these bears are organized? Professor Whitfield's expression had grown increasingly grave as Rebecca spoke. This aligns with some of our recent observations. We've noticed that the sentinel bears seem to move in patterns, appearing at medical facilities in sequences that suggest communication between different groups. Captain Rodriguez, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Professor, if these animals are as organized as you're suggesting, then we're dealing with something far beyond normal wildlife management protocols. That's exactly what I'm saying, Professor Whitfield replied, and if Rebecca's vision is accurate, we may be looking at the emergence of a new form of animal consciousness, one that includes the ability to predict and respond to human crises before they occur. Jake's radio suddenly crackled to life with an urgent message. Morrison, we have a situation developing. Multiple emergency calls coming in from the children's hospital across town. Request immediate assistance from medical personnel on site. Dr. Chen grabbed the radio from Jake. This is Dr. Chen, Pine Valley Medical. What's the nature of the emergency? The dispatcher's voice was tense with stress. Multiple pediatric respiratory emergencies, Doctor. 6 infants admitted in the past 30 minutes, all presenting with similar symptoms. And, sir, there are reports of large animals gathering in the hospital parking lot. The group exchanged looks of alarm and amazement. Rebecca felt her heart sink as she realized that her vision was already beginning to come true. We have to get over there, Dr. Chen said, already moving toward his car. Rebecca, I need you to come with me. If you can somehow communicate with these bears, we might need that ability. Professor Whitfield was already packing his equipment. I'm coming too. This could be the breakthrough we've been waiting for in understanding animal-human communication. As they prepared to leave, Captain Rodriguez called out to them. What do we do about the bears here? Do we proceed with relocation? Dr. Chen paused at his car door. Captain, based on what we've witnessed tonight, I think those bears are exactly where they need to be. I recommend leaving them alone and monitoring the situation. The drive to Children's Hospital took only 15 minutes, but it felt like an eternity to Rebecca, who sat in the passenger seat of Dr. Chen's car with her mind racing. Professor Whitfield followed behind them in his own vehicle, while Jake and the animal control officers brought up the rear. As they approached the hospital, the scene that greeted them was unlike anything any of them had ever witnessed. The parking lot was indeed filled with bears. At least 8 large females, each accompanied by cubs. They had arranged themselves in a rough circle around the main entrance to the hospital, all facing the building in what appeared to be a protective formation. This is impossible, Dr. Chen breathed as he parked his car at a safe distance from the bears. How did they all get here so quickly? Rebecca was staring at the bears with a mixture of awe and recognition. Several of the animals looked familiar, though she was certain she had never seen them before tonight. The feeling of connection she had experienced with the first bear seemed to extend to all of them, creating a web of awareness that was both exhilarating and overwhelming. They were already coming, she said quietly. They knew this was going to happen before we did. Dr. Patricia Hayes, the chief of pediatrics at Children's Hospital, emerged from the main entrance and approached their group with hurried steps. She was a small woman in her 50s with graying hair and the focused intensity of someone dealing with a major medical crisis. Dr. Chen, thank goodness you're here, she called out as she reached them. We have 6 infants in severe respiratory distress, and we can't figure out what's causing it. They all presented within minutes of each other, all with identical symptoms. Have you run toxicology tests? Dr. Chen asked, falling into step beside her as they moved toward the hospital entrance. Everything we can think of, Dr. Hayes replied. Blood work, environmental tests, infectious disease protocols. Nothing is showing up. It's like their respiratory systems just started shutting down simultaneously. As they walked past the circle of bears, Rebecca noticed that the animals were completely calm, showing none of the agitation or aggression she would expect from wild predators near a human facility. Instead, they seemed to be maintaining some kind of vigil, their attention focused entirely on the hospital building. One of the bears, a particularly large female with distinctive white markings on her chest, made eye contact with Rebecca as they passed. For a moment, Rebecca felt the same rush of connection she had experienced earlier, and suddenly she understood something that made her stop walking. "Doctor Hayes?" Rebecca called out. "The 6 babies? Were they all born within the past few weeks?" Dr. Hayes paused and looked back at Rebecca with surprise. "Yes? How did you know that?" "They're all between 3 and 8 weeks old." "And they were all born premature or with respiratory complications." "That's right. They've all been in and out of the hospital since birth for various breathing issues. But how could you possibly know that?" Rebecca looked at Professor Whitfield, who was listening to the conversation with growing excitement. "Professor, I think the bears aren't just responding to medical emergencies. I think they're predicting them." "What do you mean?" Dr. Chen asked. "The bears showed me that these babies are all connected somehow. They all have the same underlying vulnerability, something that makes them susceptible to whatever is causing tonight's crisis." Professor Whitfield was already pulling out his tablet. "If that's true, then we need to figure out what that connection is, and fast. Dr. Hayes, do you have detailed medical records for all 6 infants?" "Of course, but I don't understand how animal behavior could possibly help us diagnose a medical condition." "Because," Rebecca said, looking back at the circle of bears, "I don't think this is a medical condition in the traditional sense. I think something environmental is affecting these babies, something the bears can detect, but we can't." As if responding to her words, the bear with the white markings stood up and began walking toward the hospital entrance. The other bears remained in position, but their attention intensified, creating an almost palpable sense of urgency. "She wants us to follow her," Rebecca said, taking a step toward the approaching bear. Dr. Hayes looked alarmed. "Absolutely not. We can't have wild bears inside a hospital." But the bear had no intention of entering the building. Instead, she walked to a specific area near the main entrance and began pawing at the ground with deliberate motions. After a few moments, she sat back and looked directly at the human group, then repeated the behavior. Professor Whitfield moved closer to examine the spot where the bear had been digging. "There's something here," he said, kneeling down to get a better look. "The ground has been disturbed recently, and there's an unusual odor." Dr. Chen joined him, and immediately his expression changed. "That smell, it's chemical, industrial." Dr. Hayes suddenly went pale. "Oh my God, we've been doing construction on the new wing. They've been digging and laying new foundation for the past month. The work area is directly upwind from the neonatal unit." Rebecca felt the pieces clicking together in her mind. "The bears can smell whatever chemicals are leaching from the construction site. That's what's affecting the babies, and that's what they've been trying to warn us about." Professor Whitfield was already on his phone, calling the Environmental Emergency Hotline. "We need an immediate hazmat assessment at Children's Hospital. Possible chemical contamination affecting pediatric patients." As he made the call, the bear with the white marking stood up again and walked to another area of the parking lot. This time, she began the same pawing behavior near a storm drain that ran along the edge of the construction zone. "She's showing us the source," Rebecca realized. "Whatever leaked from the construction is flowing through the storm drain system, and it's concentrated enough that even small amounts are affecting the most vulnerable babies. Dr. Hayes was already on her radio, calling for immediate evacuation of the neonatal unit. All infants in NICU are to be moved to the East Wing immediately. Full environmental isolation protocols. As the hospital staff rushed to implement the evacuation, Rebecca found herself drawn back to the bear with the white markings. The animal had completed her demonstration and was now sitting calmly, watching the human activity with what appeared to be satisfaction. "Thank you," Rebecca whispered, approaching the bear slowly. "How did you know?" The bear made a soft sound, almost like a sigh, and Rebecca felt another brief flash of connection. This time, the sensation was different, less urgent, more educational. She saw images of the forest, of streams and soil, of the delicate balance that could be disrupted by human activity. She understood that the bear's enhanced senses allowed them to detect environmental changes long before humans could measure them with instruments. But there was something else in the vision, something that made Rebecca's blood run cold. The construction site contamination was just the beginning. The images showed her other locations, other sources of danger that would threaten children in the coming days and weeks. "Professor Whitfield," she called out urgently, "we need to expand our investigation. This isn't an isolated incident." Professor Whitfield finished his call and hurried over to Rebecca. "The environmental team is on their way. What else did you see?" "Multiple sites," Rebecca said, her voice tight with concern. "Whatever is happening here is part of a larger pattern. The bears aren't just responding to this one emergency. They're trying to prevent a widespread environmental crisis that could affect children across the entire region." As if to confirm her words, Jake's radio burst to life with another emergency call. "Multiple reports of unusual animal behavior at medical facilities throughout the tri-state area. Large bears observed at 7 different hospitals and clinics in the past 2 hours." Dr. Chen looked at the assembled group with a mixture of awe and alarm. "We're not just dealing with extraordinary animal behavior anymore. We're looking at what could be an environmental disaster of unprecedented scope." The bear with the white markings stood up and began walking back toward the forest, but she paused at the edge of the parking lot and looked back at the humans. Her expression, if a bear could be said to have expressions, seemed to convey both urgency and hope. Rebecca felt tears welling up in her eyes as she understood the full scope of what was happening. These magnificent creatures had somehow evolved beyond their normal capabilities, driven by an instinct to protect the most vulnerable members of another species. They were risking exposure to humans, leaving their safe forest territories, and expending enormous energy to warn of dangers that human technology had failed to detect. "They're trying to save us," she said quietly. "Not just the babies tonight, but all of us. They're trying to save us from ourselves." Professor Whitfield was documenting everything on his tablet, but he paused to look at Rebecca with deep respect. "And they chose you as their messenger. The question is, are we smart enough to listen?" As the environmental hazmat team arrived and began their assessment, Rebecca realized that her quiet night shift had become the beginning of something that would change the world's understanding of animal intelligence, environmental responsibility, and the interconnectedness of all living things. But first, they had to figure out how many more children were in danger, and how many more bears were out there trying to warn them. The night was far from over, and the real work was just beginning. Inside the hospital, Dr. Hayes emerged with good news. All 6 infants are responding well to the move. Their oxygen levels are improving rapidly now that they're away from the contaminated airflow. Rebecca looked back at the forest where the bears had disappeared, feeling a profound sense of gratitude mixed with responsibility. Somehow, she had become the bridge between 2 species, and the weight of that role was both terrifying and magnificent. "Dr. Chen," she said, "I think we need to prepare for a very long night. If my visions are accurate, this is just the beginning." The environmental team leader, a stern man named Director Thompson, approached their group with preliminary test results. "We're detecting significant levels of methylene chloride and other industrial solvents in the air around the construction site. These chemicals are particularly dangerous to developing respiratory systems." "How extensive is the contamination?" Professor Whitfield asked. Director Thompson's expression was grim. "Based on wind patterns and drainage systems, we're looking at potential exposure across a 15-mile radius. Any medical facility in that area could be affected, especially those with vulnerable populations." Rebecca felt a chill of recognition. "That's exactly what I saw in the vision. Professor, we need to contact every hospital, clinic, and care facility in that radius immediately." As teams began coordinating the massive response effort, Rebecca found herself thinking about Marcus Thompson, safe in his crib back at Pine Valley Medical. One bear's inexplicable action had saved his life and potentially countless others. But the questions remained. How had the bears developed this ability? Why had they chosen to help humans? And what other environmental disasters were they trying to warn about? The answers, Rebecca suspected, would challenge everything humanity thought it knew about intelligence, consciousness, and their place in the natural world. And somewhere in the forest, a mother bear with white markings was probably already moving toward the next crisis, driven by an instinct that transcended species barriers and touched something universal about the drive to protect the innocent. As the emergency response teams coordinated their efforts across multiple facilities, Rebecca found herself standing at the edge of the parking lot, staring into the darkness of the forest. The connection she had felt with the bears was still pulsing through her consciousness like a distant heartbeat, and she could sense that they hadn't gone far. Professor Whitfield approached her, his tablet glowing in the darkness as he reviewed data from the expanding crisis. "Rebecca, I've been analyzing the pattern of bear appearances tonight. There's something remarkable happening that goes beyond what we initially understood." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked, though part of her already suspected what he was going to tell her. "The timing isn't random. Each bear appeared at their respective location exactly 47 minutes before the medical crisis reached critical levels. That's too precise to be coincidence. It suggests they're not just detecting environmental hazards. They're calculating the progression of those hazards with mathematical precision." Dr. Chen joined them, his phone pressed to his ear, as he coordinated with medical facilities across the region. "I just got off the phone with Memorial Hospital downtown. They've had a large bear outside their pediatric unit for the past 30 minutes. No medical emergencies yet, but based on our pattern." "There will be," Rebecca finished. "In about 17 minutes, if the pattern holds." Professor Whitfield looked at her with surprise. "How did you calculate that so quickly?" Rebecca touched her temple, where a slight headache had been building since her first connection with the bear. "I didn't calculate it. I can feel it. The bears are still connected to me somehow, and I can sense their urgency about Memorial Hospital." Before anyone could respond, Jake's radio erupted with multiple emergency calls. "All units, we have reports of large bears at Mercy General, St. Mary's Children's Clinic and Regional Medical Center. Animals appear to be non-aggressive, but are refusing to leave hospital grounds." Dr. Chen immediately began coordinating response teams. "This is beyond anything we could have imagined. We're looking at a coordinated warning system spanning the entire metropolitan area." Director Thompson, who had been overseeing the environmental assessment, approached the group with a grim expression. "Dr. Chen, we've expanded our testing to include the broader area. What we're finding is disturbing." "How disturbing?" Professor Whitfield asked. The contamination isn't limited to construction sites. We're detecting chemical signatures that suggest a systematic pattern of environmental poisoning across multiple locations. Someone or some organization has been deliberately introducing industrial toxins into areas near medical facilities. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. You're saying this is intentional? That's exactly what I'm saying. The chemical combinations we're finding don't occur naturally, and they're specifically designed to affect developing respiratory systems. This isn't an accident, it's sabotage. The implications of Director Thompson's words settled over the group like a physical weight. Rebecca found herself thinking about Marcus Thompson and all the other vulnerable infants who had been unwittingly exposed to deliberate poisoning. Who would do something like this? Dr. Chen asked, his voice filled with disgust and anger. Director Thompson pulled out his phone. That's what we need to find out. I'm calling the FBI. This is now a federal investigation. As Director Thompson made his call, Rebecca noticed something that made her heart race. At the edge of the forest, she could see eyes reflecting the hospital lights, not just one or two pairs, but dozens. The bears were gathering, and their numbers were growing. Professor Whitfield, she said quietly, look at the tree line. Professor Whitfield followed her gaze and gasped. There must be at least 20 bears out there. This is unprecedented behavior. Bears don't gather in groups this large except under extraordinary circumstances. Rebecca took a step toward the forest, drawn by the same inexplicable pull she had felt all night. As she moved closer, the largest bear, the one with white markings who had shown them the contamination source, emerged from the group and approached her. This time, when the bear reached out with her massive paw, Rebecca didn't hesitate. She placed her hand against the warm fur, and immediately her consciousness was flooded with images more vivid and complex than anything she had experienced before. She saw maps, detailed layouts of the city from an aerial perspective that no bear should have been able to comprehend. She saw specific buildings marked with symbols, routes traced through underground systems, and most disturbing of all, she saw human figures in dark clothing moving through the night with containers of toxic chemicals. But there was something else in the vision that made Rebecca gasp aloud. The bears weren't just responding to current contamination. They were tracking the source. They had been following the perpetrators, learning their patterns and predicting their next targets. Rebecca? Dr. Chen's voice seemed to come from very far away. What are you seeing? The bears, Rebecca said, her voice strained with the effort of processing the overwhelming flow of information. They've been watching the people who are doing this. They know who they are and where they're going next. The vision shifted, and Rebecca found herself seeing through the eyes of multiple bears simultaneously. She watched as groups of the animals moved through the forest with military-like precision, each group assigned to monitor different areas of the city. She saw them communicating through vocalizations too complex for human ears to fully interpret, coordinating their efforts to protect as many children as possible. This is incredible, Professor Whitfield breathed, watching Rebecca's connection with fascination. They've developed not just enhanced intelligence, but strategic thinking and tactical coordination. The vision continued, showing Rebecca something that made her blood run cold. The poisoning campaign wasn't random. It was targeting specific demographics. The perpetrators were focusing on areas with high concentrations of premature infants, children with compromised immune systems, and families from lower socioeconomic backgrounds who were less likely to have access to immediate medical care. It's genocide, Rebecca whispered, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. They're trying to eliminate vulnerable children systematically. Dr. Chen stepped closer, his face pale with horror. Rebecca, are you saying this is a coordinated attack on children? The bear's connection intensified, and suddenly Rebecca was seeing real-time images of the perpetrators in action. 3 figures in dark clothing were approaching a water treatment facility that supplied several pediatric care centers. They carried containers that she somehow knew contained concentrated toxins designed to be undetectable until children began showing symptoms. "They're at the water treatment plant on Riverside Drive," Rebecca said urgently. "Right now. They're about to contaminate the water supply for half the city's medical facilities." Director Thompson, who had finished his call with the FBI, immediately grabbed his radio. "All units, proceed to Riverside Water Treatment immediately. We have suspects in the act of environmental terrorism." As emergency vehicles began racing toward the water treatment plant, the bear released her connection with Rebecca, but not before sharing one final image that left Rebecca trembling. She saw herself standing in a courtroom, testifying about what the bears had shown her. But more importantly, she saw dozens of children, alive, healthy, and safe, who would have died without the intervention of the bear sentinels. "Professor," Rebecca said, turning to face Whitfield with tears streaming down her face, "do you understand what just happened? These bears have evolved beyond anything we thought possible. They've become protectors not just of their own species, but of ours." Professor Whitfield was documenting everything on his tablet, his hands shaking with excitement and awe. "Rebecca, what you've experienced tonight represents the most significant leap in interspecies communication in human history. The implications for our understanding of consciousness, intelligence, and environmental awareness are staggering." Dr. Chen's phone rang, and he answered it quickly. After a brief conversation, he turned back to the group with relief evident on his face. That was the FBI team at the water treatment plant. They caught 3 suspects in the act of introducing chemical compounds into the water system. The bear's intelligence was accurate. Rebecca looked back at the forest, where the gathering of bears remained visible in the shadows. The mother bear with white markings was sitting calmly, as if she knew her message had been received and acted upon. "There's more," Rebecca said quietly. "This isn't over. The bears are showing me that there are other groups, other targets. This is part of something much larger than we realized." Director Thompson approached them with his phone still pressed to his ear. "The FBI wants to speak with you, Rebecca. They need to understand how you obtained intelligence about the suspect's location." Rebecca felt a moment of panic. How could she explain that bears had shown her visions of environmental terrorists? Who would believe such an extraordinary story? "Professor Whitfield," she said, "I need your help. No one is going to believe what really happened here tonight." Professor Whitfield nodded gravely. "Leave that to me. I have 8 months of documented research that will support your testimony. The scientific community needs to hear about this, and the legal system needs to understand what these bears have accomplished." As FBI agents began arriving at the hospital, Rebecca found herself thinking about the complexity of what had unfolded. The bears hadn't just saved individual children. They had uncovered and helped stop what appeared to be a systematic campaign of environmental terrorism targeting the most vulnerable members of society. But even as she prepared to tell her story to the authorities, Rebecca could feel the continuing presence of the bears in her consciousness. They weren't finished with their mission, and somehow she had become their chosen spokesperson in the human world. Agent Sarah Martinez, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, approached Rebecca with a notepad and a skeptical expression. "Ms. Winters, I understand you have information about the suspects we apprehended tonight?" Rebecca looked at Professor Whitfield, who nodded encouragingly, then back at Agent Martinez. "Agent, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I have witnesses and scientific documentation to support every word." "I'm listening," Agent Martinez said, though her tone suggested she was prepared for another crackpot theory. Rebecca took a deep breath and began to tell the story of the most extraordinary night of her life. As she spoke, she could see Agent Martinez's skepticism gradually giving way to amazement, then to a kind of awe that mirrored what Rebecca herself had been feeling all evening. "Let me get this straight," Agent Martinez said when Rebecca finished. "You're telling me that bears, wild bears, have been conducting surveillance on environmental terrorists and communicating their findings to you through some kind of psychic connection." "I know how it sounds," Rebecca replied, "but check with your team at the water treatment plant. Ask them how we knew exactly where the suspects would be and what they would be doing." Agent Martinez stepped away to make a phone call, and while she was gone, Rebecca noticed that the gathering of bears in the forest had begun to disperse. Groups of 2 or 3 animals were moving off in different directions, each group heading toward a different part of the city. "They're going to monitor other locations," Rebecca realized. "They're not going to stop until they've identified every threat." Professor Whitfield was already tracking the bears' movements on his tablet, using GPS coordinates from various wildlife cameras throughout the region. "This is remarkable, Rebecca. They're systematically covering every major medical facility and pediatric care center in a 50-mile radius." Dr. Chen shook his head in amazement. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up from this dream, but it just keeps getting more incredible." Agent Martinez returned with a changed expression. Her skepticism had been replaced by professional curiosity mixed with a healthy dose of respect. "Ms. Winters, I don't know how you obtained your information, but it was 100% accurate. The suspects were exactly where you said they would be, doing exactly what you said they would be doing. They've confessed to being part of a larger organization that's been systematically targeting vulnerable children across multiple states." Rebecca felt a wave of relief wash over her. "So, you believe me?" "I believe that you have access to intelligence that helped us stop a major terrorist operation," Agent Martinez replied carefully. "The source of that intelligence is unusual, but the results speak for themselves." As dawn began to break over the city, Rebecca found herself exhausted but exhilarated. The night that had started with a single bear and a breathless infant had evolved into something that would change her life forever. But even as the immediate crisis resolved, Rebecca could feel the bear's continued presence in her consciousness. They had chosen her as their liaison with humanity, and she knew that this was only the beginning of a partnership that would challenge everything the world thought it knew about the intelligence and compassion of the natural world. The mother bear, with white markings, appeared one last time at the edge of the forest, meeting Rebecca's eyes across the parking lot. For a moment, the connection flared again, and Rebecca understood that this was not goodbye. It was a promise. The bears would continue their vigil, and when they needed to communicate with the human world, they would call on her. As the bear disappeared into the dawn light, Rebecca realized that her quiet life as a night shift nurse had ended forever. She was now something unprecedented in human history, the first official ambassador between humanity and the evolved consciousness of the natural world. And somewhere in the city, other children were sleeping safely because a group of bears had chosen to become their guardians. 3 months later, Rebecca stood before the United Nations Environmental Council, her hands steady as she held the wooden carving that had started it all. The tiny figure, carved by bear claws with impossible precision, had become a symbol of hope that resonated around the world. "The bears taught us something we had forgotten," Rebecca said, her voice carrying to every corner of the assembly hall. "They reminded us that protecting the innocent isn't just a human responsibility, It's a universal one that transcends species, intelligence levels, and even our understanding of what's possible. In the audience, Professor Whitfield smiled as he watched his former research subject command the attention of world leaders. His comprehensive study of the sentinel bears had revolutionized the scientific understanding of animal consciousness and led to the establishment of the first Interspecies Communication Institute. Dr. Chen, now serving as the Director of Pediatric Environmental Safety, sat beside Marcus Thompson's parents. Baby Marcus, now 6 months old and thriving, had become the poster child for environmental protection awareness. His near-death experience had catalyzed changes in hospital safety protocols worldwide. Agent Martinez, who had been promoted to head the FBI's new Environmental Terrorism Division, watched from the security section. The arrests that night had led to the dismantling of a network spanning 12 countries, saving countless children from systematic poisoning campaigns. But it was the empty seat in the front row that meant the most to Rebecca. That seat was reserved for the mother bear with white markings, officially designated as Sentinel-1 in all government documents. Though the bear couldn't attend the ceremony, her presence was felt in every word Rebecca spoke. The terrorists targeted our most vulnerable because they believed no one was watching, Rebecca continued. They were wrong. The earth itself was watching, through eyes that saw beyond human perception and hearts that beat with love for all innocent life. As Rebecca concluded her speech, she felt the familiar warmth of connection pulse through her consciousness. Somewhere in the forests surrounding the city, the sentinel bears continued their vigil. The network had grown to include over 300 bears across 6 continents, each one trained by the original group to detect environmental threats and communicate with specially selected human partners. Rebecca had become the first of many interspecies ambassadors, individuals who could bridge the gap between human society and the evolved consciousness that had emerged in the natural world. Children who might have died were now living because bears had learned to love beyond the boundaries of their own species. After the ceremony, Rebecca returned to Pine Valley Medical Center, where she now served as Director of Environmental Safety. As she walked through the halls where her extraordinary journey had begun, she smiled at the sight of a new addition to the neonatal unit. A large window that faced the forest, installed so that staff could always see their silent guardians keeping watch. That evening, as her shift ended, Rebecca walked to the loading dock where it all began. The red emergency button had been preserved as a memorial, with a bronze plaque that read, "In honor of those who speak for the voiceless and protect those who cannot protect themselves." As she stood in the exact spot where the mother bear had pressed that button, Rebecca felt a gentle touch on her consciousness. The connection was softer now, more like a warm embrace than the urgent visions of that first night. In her mind, she saw images of children playing safely in parks, breathing clean air and drinking pure water. She saw hospitals around the world where environmental monitoring systems worked in partnership with wildlife observers. She saw a future where the boundaries between human and animal consciousness had blurred into something beautiful and protective. Most importantly, she saw love, the kind of love that transcends species and transforms ordinary creatures into heroes. A soft sound from the forest made her look up, and there, at the edge of the tree line, stood the mother bear with white markings. Beside her were 2 young cubs, now nearly grown, who had learned their mother's purpose and would carry it forward to future generations. The bear lifted her massive head and let out a gentle call, not the urgent alarm of that first night, but a sound of peace, satisfaction, and continuing promise. Rebecca raised her hand in acknowledgement, and for a moment, human and bear stood in perfect understanding. Then the bear turned and disappeared into the forest with her cubs, but Rebecca knew she would never truly be gone. None of them would. The sentinel bears had become more than protectors. They had become proof that love, compassion, and the drive to protect the innocent were truly universal languages. As Rebecca walked back toward the hospital, she thought about Marcus Thompson, sleeping safely in his crib, and about thousands of other children around the world who were alive because a mother bear had chosen to ring an alarm for someone else's baby. The wooden carving in her pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, a reminder that miracles weren't just possible, they were happening every day, in the spaces between species where love learned to speak in new voices. And in hospitals around the world, mothers, both human and bear, continued their ancient calling. To guard the innocent, to sound the alarm when danger approached, and to prove that the most powerful force in any universe is the fierce love of a mother protecting her young, even when that young belongs to another species entirely. The bears had taught humanity its most important lesson. That true evolution isn't about becoming smarter or stronger. It's about learning to love beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. In the forest, a new generation of bears was already learning to read the signs of environmental danger, to recognize the sounds of medical equipment, and to understand that sometimes the greatest courage comes from caring about others more than yourself. The vigil continued, and love had found a new way to save the world.